The morning fog curled low over Maple Harbor's docks, softening the sharp edges of the world in a mere breath. Caleb Turner stood on his weathered back porch, a ceramic mug warming his hands as he watched the pale sun struggle to break through the haze. He was a man who appeared carved from the coastal wind itself, lean in the way men become after decades of lifting gear and carrying burdens heavier than they speak of, with shoulders that still held the shape of responsibility. His hair, once coal black, now carried a dignified gray that brushed softly around his temples. A contour of stubble, silvered and textured, outlined a jaw dipped in quiet resilience, the kind a man earns after too many nights keeping watch for ghosts only he can sense. Lines radiated from his eyes, not the lines born of laughter, but of decisions that never felt good, only necessary. At his feet rested Rocky, his 7-year-old German shepherd, whose coat remained mostly sable, except for a streak of white frosting his muzzle and a faint scar tracing the outer edge of his left hind leg. Rocky had once been the bravest creature Caleb had ever known, sharp-eyed, steady-hearted, the kind of dog who ran toward collapsing beams while others ran away. But now, even years after the explosion that had shattered their unit, the dog's ears sometimes twitched uncontrollably at distant sirens, as if sound alone could tug him backward through time. Rocky's amber eyes shifted often, searching Caleb's face as though confirming that the man he trusted most was still here, still standing, still breathing. Caleb reached down to stroke the dog's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though the morning was peaceful. He always spoke like this, reassurance on instinct, quiet on purpose. Rocky leaned into the touch, his breath warm against Caleb's wrist. It had been 10 years since Caleb Turner walked out of a burning warehouse carrying only a limp dog and a fractured conscience. The fire had been one of the worst in the state that year, an inferno ignited by a chemical leak deep inside an abandoned shipping facility. Caleb, then a senior rescue operative, had gone in with 3 men and 1 dog. He had come out alone with Rocky half-conscious in his arms, lungs seared and skin blistered. The one person he couldn't save, Captain Lawrence Doyle, a broad-shouldered leader with an unwavering moral center, had been more than just a superior. He had been Caleb's friend, guide, and compass through a career defined by chaos. The loss left a jagged hollow inside Caleb that no medal or commendation ever reached. Rocky's whine that night, soft and pained by injury, became the soundtrack of Caleb's guilt. They both survived the explosion that collapsed the warehouse roof, but neither survived unchanged. After months of rehabilitation, physical for Rocky, emotional for Caleb, they left the fire department with quiet resignation. Caleb never complained openly, but those who had known him before often murmured that he became a man who looked like he owed the world something and didn't know how to pay it back. He tried anyway. Becoming a real estate agent in Maple Harbor had seemed odd to some. Rescuers didn't usually switch to selling houses, but for Caleb, the shift made sense in a way he rarely explained. Houses meant safety, roofs meant protection, and every family he placed into a solid home felt like one more drop of water thrown on the blaze in his chest. Maple Harbor, a small coastal town with clapboard houses and boats rocking in small tides, welcomed him slowly. Locals learned that Caleb wasn't much of a talker, but he listened with a clarity that made others open up. He remembered details: whose son was in the Navy, whose mother had arthritis, which family needed a ramp built for their elderly father. He helped without being asked, showed up with tools on weekends, fixed broken steps, replaced screens, and everything he did with Rocky pacing at his side, steady as a shadow. Rocky, however, carried his own ghosts. When the distant echo of a fire truck horn drifted across town from the central station, the dog's body stiffened. His front paws planted deeper, his tail lowered, and a tremor rippled beneath his fur. Caleb felt it instantly, as if dog and man shared one nervous system. "You're all right," Caleb would say, kneeling beside him. "It's not our fire." But the words were more for himself. Sometimes, as sirens faded, Caleb realized his own chest had tightened, breath held like he expected an old command to ring out. "Unit 7, move now." Neighbors knew little about the specifics of Caleb's past, except that he used to run into fires and that Rocky used to be one of those hero dogs. That was enough. People respected him, even though he kept his distance. Except for a woman named Sarah Granger, who tended to appear at the periphery of his days more often than seemed accidental. Sarah lived 2 houses down, a woman in her mid-50s with warm brown hair, streaked in honey and loosely tied back most days. She was tall, with willow-like posture, elegant but earth-worn, like someone who had weathered both storms and kindness without losing her softness. She taught art classes part-time at the community center and had a gentle manner that made even the most nervous children settle near her. She wore clothing in simple colors: sage greens, blues, soft creams, as if she preferred not to interrupt the world's palette too loudly. When she looked at Caleb, her eyes, light hazel, flecked with green, held a quiet knowing, the kind found in people who had lost enough to recognize loss in others. Her late husband, a fisherman, had gone missing in a winter storm 12 years before. His boat was found, but not him. Since then, Sarah carried herself with a serenity layered over the faintest seam of sorrow, like a quilt mended many times. She smiled easily, but never too brightly, as though she saved her true warmth for those who needed it most. Rocky adored her immediately. "Morning, Caleb," she called across the shared fence this particular day, her hands dusted with bits of soil from the herbs she was tending. "Rocky already told me you're awake. I heard his tail thump against the gate." Caleb nodded, offering a small, reserved smile. "Morning, Sarah." He always felt slightly off balance in her presence, as if she could see through layers he preferred to keep closed. Still, she never pushed, never questioned too deeply. She simply let him be, which made him willing to talk more than he planned. "If you need help with the gutters before the rain sets in, I'm around today," she added. "No plans beyond reorganizing my studio and pretending it'll stay that way." "Appreciate it," Caleb replied. "Might take you up on that." But Sarah paused, studying him for a beat longer than usual. Just a flicker, barely there. Something about him must have seemed heavier today, though even Caleb wasn't fully aware of it yet. He only knew that his sleep had been restless, filled with disjointed fragments of a warehouse ceiling coming down, a captain shouting orders, and Rocky crying out. He brushed it off. Dreams could be liars, but the weight clung anyway. Later, he walked Rocky down to the harbor path, past fishing boats bobbing lazily. The townspeople were beginning to stir. Mr. Dempsey, the elderly Navy veteran with one good knee and a stubborn pride, sat outside the bait shop sipping coffee. Lena Ruiz, the teenage barista with silver piercings and quick, tired eyes, chalked the daily specials outside the cafe. Maple Harbor was a place of gentle repetition, comfortingly predictable, exactly what Caleb had needed when he arrived a decade ago with nothing but a broken dog and a broken purpose. Yet today, beneath the familiar rhythm, something felt misaligned. Rocky sensed it too. He kept glancing back toward town, muscles taut, as if waiting for a sound that hadn't yet been made. Caleb tried to shake the unease, but a strange undercurrent hummed in his chest, a pressure he recognized from years of walking into smoke-filled hallways. Something is about to break. And just as that thought settled, Rocky stopped abruptly, ears high, body rigid. He released a low, cautious growl, one that Caleb hadn't heard in years. Caleb followed Rocky's gaze toward the old storage wharf at the far edge of the harbor, abandoned, boarded up, empty for decades. But in the second-story window, behind cracked panes and peeling paint, Caleb saw it. The faintest glow, orange, pulsing, like a flame trying to breathe. And suddenly, Caleb couldn't tell if the fire was real or if the past had finally come to claim him. Caleb Turner had always thought funerals were quieter than the lives of the people they honored. But Captain Franklin Hayes's farewell had been louder than most. Expensive suits rustling, fake condolences traded like scripted lines, and a kind of restless hunger that lingered beneath every handshake. Now, a week later, the reading of the will took place on the third floor of a brick law office overlooking Maple Harbor's modest courthouse square. The setting was formal, but the air felt heavy with concealed ambition. The conference room carried that peculiar smell of old books and anticipation. At the head of a long mahogany table sat attorney Malcolm Reed, a man in his early 70s with a face lined like folded parchment and thick white eyebrows that drooped at the ends as if they were tired of holding themselves up. He wore a charcoal suit, the fabric impeccably pressed, but his hands, large and veined, trembled just slightly when he shuffled his papers. Reed was known in town as a man of rigid professionalism, slow to joke, slower to trust, softened only by the rumor that his wife had died decades ago, leaving behind a loneliness he never remarried to escape. Around the table were the Hayes family, three people who looked as though their grief had been neatly ironed out of them before they walked in. Franklin's widow sat closest to Reed, Eleanor Hayes, mid-50s, impeccably kept, with blonde hair arranged into a sculpted twist, pearl earrings gleaming like tiny moons. Her face was beautiful, in a cold, sculpted way, the kind of beauty that made a room feel colder rather than warmer. She moved with precise elegance, every gesture measured, her voice soft but clipped, like she'd trained herself not to waste syllables. To her right sat the son, Mitchell Hayes, a man in his early 30s, with a jawline too sharp to be friendly, and hair so dark it almost looked dyed. Mitchell had the tautness of someone used to controlling rooms. CEO arrogance mixed with the impatience of someone who believed time was a resource meant for him alone. He kept glancing at his watch, an expensive silver piece that flashed under the overhead lights. Next to him was the daughter, Caroline Hayes, about 28, whose beauty was soft where Eleanor's was sharpened. A sweep of brown hair, gentle features, a patterned green dress that suggested she cared about being seen as approachable. But her eyes betrayed her, too observant, too calculating, scanning the room with subtle alertness. Caroline smiled often, but never with her eyes. The sort of person whose friendliness felt rehearsed rather than felt. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, wearing his only good jacket, one he usually reserved for closings with first-time homebuyers. It felt too stiff on his shoulders today. Rocky waited outside. Animals weren't allowed in the office, but even without seeing him, Caleb could almost sense the dog's steady presence at the door. Rocky had a way of anchoring him when he felt adrift. And this room, with its gleaming wood and hungry stares, felt like open water. Attorney Reed cleared his throat. "Let us proceed." His voice carried the dryness of old paper, but commanded attention. He began with Eleanor. She received the Hayes residence overlooking the bay, a home worth more than most buildings downtown combined. Mitchell received stock control of 3 Hayes family business ventures, plus access to accounts Reed described, with numbers so long they sounded fictional. Caroline received a beach property, a trust fund, and ownership of the Hayes Foundation's philanthropic assets. Each announcement was followed by murmured approval, gasps, touches to hearts, reactions that felt almost theatrical. Caleb's stomach tightened slightly. He had never cared about inheritance, but there was a strange ache forming between his ribs, the same ache he felt when people told him Rocky was just a dog, as if love was measured in numbers. Finally, Reed looked at Caleb. The room quieted, not respectfully, but like an audience bracing for the punchline. "For Mr. Caleb Turner," Reed said, reaching for a thin envelope. "Captain Hayes leaves this." Reed pushed the envelope across the table. Caleb accepted it with gratitude, though he felt the eyes on him like needles. Inside, he found 2 items: a worn $2 bill, edges frayed from years of handling, and a small round metal tag, no larger than a coin, with a dull silver sheen and a string of numbers etched around its circumference, numbers worn down by time and friction. A snort broke the silence. Mitchell. $2, he muttered. Guess even Dad had a sense of humor. Eleanor let out a soft laugh masked behind a gloved hand. Caroline smiled with thin-lipped amusement. Someone whispered, "His dog probably got more." And a ripple of laughter followed. Caleb stared at the objects in his hand. He waited for insult to sting, but instead he felt something different. Confusion, yes, but also a peculiar tug of recognition. The numbers on the tag weren't random. They sat on his tongue like a name he once knew. Attorney Reed continued professionally, as though the laughter didn't exist. "This concludes the reading." Caleb rose quietly, the envelope slipping into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said, voice even. He walked toward the exit with measured steps, ignoring the chuckles behind him. But as he reached the door, he heard a final comment. Mitchell again. "Guess Dad left the charity cases the charity money." Another round of laughter cracked open behind him. Outside, Rocky rose at once, pressing his head into Caleb's hand, tail stiffened in concern. Caleb exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Let's go, partner," he murmured. Rocky nudged his palm again, as if reminding him he was not walking out alone this time. As they walked along the sidewalk toward town, Caleb kept touching the metal tag in his pocket, rolling its worn edge between his fingers. The numbers etched on the surface resurfaced something old in his mind. Not a memory exactly, but a place, a feeling of metal lockers and concrete floors, of Captain Hayes's booming laughter echoing through training halls. By late afternoon, Caleb found himself inside Harbor Brew House, the cafe owned by Laura Bennett. She was a woman in her early 50s, petite and strong-willed, with curly copper hair cut to her shoulders and freckles scattered across her cheeks like sunlit sparks. Her cafe smelled of cinnamon, warm bread, and worn hardwood. She moved with the kind of soft efficiency born from years of single-handedly running a business while raising two sons, one in the Air Force, the other working as a mechanic out of state. Laura had a way of reading people without prying, a trait she'd honed after losing her husband to a sudden heart attack 8 years earlier. She had carried that grief with quiet grace, and because she had learned exactly how fragile a day could be, she often grounded others with simple comforts: coffee, warmth, and listening. Rocky adored her too, always settling under his usual corner booth. It was the one place he relaxed fully, stretched out instead of curled tight. "You look like someone dropped a house on your shoulders," Laura said as she slid a cup of black coffee before him. Then her eyes narrowed slightly. "What's in your hand?" Caleb hadn't realized he'd been turning the metal tag over and over. He handed it to her without thinking. Laura examined it, brows furrowing. "Well, I haven't seen one of these in ages." She angled the tag toward the light. "This looks like the old ID tag for the personal lockers at the Regional Fire Training Center, the one that closed down years ago." Caleb's heartbeat stalled. He hadn't stepped foot in that building since the explosion. Franklin Hayes had trained him there long before they'd become a unit, long before tragedy had tethered them together in ways people never saw. Laura handed the tag back. "Why would he leave you this?" Caleb stared at the numbers again. Now the recognition was undeniable. It was the number of the training locker Captain Hayes always used. The same locker where he kept the old field journals he scribbled in. The same locker he checked compulsively before every shift, as though what he kept inside mattered more than anyone knew. Rocky lifted his head, ears perked sharply, watching Caleb with unusual alertness. Caleb whispered, almost to himself, "I think he left me something. Something that isn't in that will." Laura leaned closer, eyes intent. "Caleb, what if he meant for you to find whatever's still inside that locker?" Caleb didn't answer, because a realization was forming, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. If that locker still existed, locked away in the abandoned training center, then the $2 bill and the metal tag weren't insults. They were instructions, and whatever Franklin Hayes wanted Caleb to find, whatever truth he had buried, might finally pull Caleb back into a fire he thought he'd escaped. The storm rolled into Maple Harbor by late afternoon, the kind of coastal tempest that whipped the trees into frantic bowing and painted the sky in bruised shades of gray. Caleb Turner watched the incoming squall from his truck's windshield as he parked at the base of the old training tower. The structure stood at the edge of Briar Hill, just where the forest thinned and the coastline dipped. 4 stories of scorched brick and steel frames, a skeleton of the past. Rain slashed sideways against its cracked windows, and the wind hummed through its hollow corridors like a warning made of breath. Rocky sat in the passenger seat, ears half raised, sensing something undefined. His coat looked darker in the dim light, the wet edges around his paws already showing his impatience. Caleb glanced at the metal tag in his hand, the weight of it odd for its size. The numbers were unmistakable now. 27B. Captain Hayes's locker, the very one he kept tucked at the far end of the tower's ground floor corridor. "This won't take long," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure whom he was reassuring, Rocky or himself. The moment he opened the truck door, Rocky jumped out, paws splashing in shallow puddles. Rain plastered Caleb's hair against his forehead, trickling cold down the back of his neck. He zipped his jacket to his chin, gripped the flashlight in his right hand, and walked toward the training tower. From a distance, the building resembled a watchtower that had seen too much. Up close, it was worse. Rust crept along the metal reinforcements like a disease. Thick scorch marks stained the concrete walls, scars from decades of controlled burns and rescue drills. A weather-beaten sign hung crookedly near the entrance. Restricted access. Condemned structure. A red city code stamp confirmed the building was scheduled for demolition. Rocky paused at the door, nose working the air, body stiff, tail lowered. His instincts jittered with caution. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's neck. "I know, boy. I feel it too." He pushed the warped door open, and the hinges shrieked like some creature being woken against its will. Inside, the air was colder, thick with the scent of damp concrete and forgotten history. Water dripped somewhere in a repetitive cadence that echoed faintly. The flashlight beam cut through dust motes and old training debris, torn hoses, collapsed practice mannequins, metal ladders stacked sideways like bones. Caleb swallowed. The sound of his footsteps, mixed with Rocky's claws tapping the floor, brought back another sound. Frantic running across breaking floorboards, the roar of fire, Captain Hayes shouting over a radio, "Turner, pull him out! Pull him out!" The memory flashed like lightning behind his eyes, sharp enough to stall his breath. He stopped walking. Rocky nudged his knee once, grounding him. Caleb exhaled shakily. "Locker 27B," he whispered. The corridor felt longer than he remembered. Rusty lockers lined both sides, some dented, some hanging open as if raided years ago. But the locker at the far end, 27B, remained closed, its metal surface covered in red dust and faint scorch residue. A chain wrapped around it once, but was now melted and fused, likely from an old burn exercise or chemical flash. The original padlock hung useless from its latch. Caleb touched the locker door. Beneath the grime, he felt the slight indentation where Hayes had once scraped his own initials, FH, into the metal. He remembered watching Hayes do it during a break years ago. The man joking, "If they bulldoze this place one day, I want my ghost to know where to find its things." Caleb felt his throat tighten. Rocky sniffed at the lower vents, then jerked back suddenly with a low growl. Caleb knelt to examine the vents and saw a thin crack along the frame. The locker wasn't fused shut, just jammed by time. He wedged his fingers under the edge and pulled hard. The door groaned, fought him, then gave way with a metallic shriek. Dust puffed out like breath from an old lung, and Caleb covered his nose with an instinctive arm. When it settled, he shined the flashlight inside. Clothes long decayed, a pair of boots, a faded training manual. a charred photograph of the original fire team, 5 men and 1 dog. Himself among them, much younger, smiling in a way he hadn't for years. And tucked behind a stack of notebooks was a small steel lockbox, the kind used for documents or valuables. It was scratched, dented, and cold to the touch. As Caleb reached for it, lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the entire tower with a sudden flash. Thunder cracked an instant later, shaking dust from the rafters. Rocky barked once, loud, sharp, before growling again, deeper this time. A sound followed, a creak, long and low, like the groaning of old beams shifting under strain. Then another, then another. The tower seemed to inhale. "Easy, boy," Caleb said, but his voice wavered. Rocky's hackles rose. He backed up a step, staring at the ceiling above them. Caleb followed the dog's gaze, lifting the flashlight. Through the dim, he saw the wood along the upper landing bow slightly. Water streamed across it in rivulets from a leak in the roof. The beam creaked again, louder. Caleb's instincts kicked in like muscle memory. Get out. Now. He grabbed the steel lockbox, tucked it under his arm, and took 2 steps backward. As he turned to leave, a violent gust slammed into the tower, and a section of ceiling near the staircase cracked with an explosive pop. A fist-sized chunk of plaster fell and shattered beside him. Dust swirled instantly, thick and suffocating. His lungs constricted. For a split second, he wasn't in the tower. He was back inside the burning warehouse, the heat blistering his skin, Hayes shouting, ceiling caving, Rocky whining in pain under debris. Caleb's fingers trembled. His knees nearly buckled. Rocky barked, snapping him out of the memory. The dog lunged forward, teeth gripping Caleb's pant leg. Not a warning, a pull. Then the floor beneath Caleb gave a long, deep groan. "Rocky!" The dog yanked harder, and just as Caleb staggered forward, the section of floor where he had stood split open with a brutal crack, dropping dust and chunks of concrete into the darkness below. Caleb stumbled, falling to one knee but catching himself. The lockbox clutched tightly. Rocky tugged again, dragging him toward the exit. Ceilings cracked overhead. Glass shattered somewhere deeper inside the tower, a cascading sound, a chain of breaking memories. Adrenaline flooded him. He shoved himself up and followed the dog. Together, they sprinted down the corridor, slipping on wet cement, debris raining behind them in sporadic plinks and thuds. The entire structure felt alive in collapse, each gust of wind rattling its fragile bones. Halfway to the exit, the storm outside detonated with a roar of wind so strong the walls trembled. A window pane to their right burst outward, shards scattering across the hall. Rocky skidded briefly, but kept running. Caleb shielded his eyes and pushed harder. The tower shook again. A low groan rippled through the floor. "We're almost out," Caleb yelled, though he could barely hear himself above the storm. At last, the warped entry door appeared through the haze of dust. Rocky crashed into it first, forcing the stiff panel open just enough for Caleb to shove through. Rain slapped their faces as they burst into the open air. Behind them, as if deciding it had held together long enough, another sheet of glass shattered inside the tower, echoing outward like the last breath of the building. Caleb staggered away from the entrance, chest heaving, legs trembling. Rocky circled him, tail down, ears flattened, pacing anxiously. Caleb looked down at the steel lockbox still secured under his arm. Whatever Captain Hayes had hidden inside it, whatever truth he meant for Caleb to find, it had nearly cost him his life a second time. Lightning illuminated the tower behind them, and for a heartbeat, Caleb swore he saw the ghost of a silhouette in the broken window on the second floor, watching. He blinked, and it was gone. But the cold in his spine stayed, and the lockbox suddenly felt heavier than before, too heavy for what it might contain. The rain had softened into a steady whisper by the time Caleb and Rocky returned home, both soaked and streaked with dust from the collapsing tower. Maple Harbor's street lamps flickered through the mist, casting warm halos across the quiet road. Caleb's small wooden house, its porch light glowing like a lighthouse lantern, felt like the only still place left in a world tilting at the edges. When he pushed the front door open, the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted toward him. Laura Bennett stood just inside the kitchen doorway, her copper curls damp from the rain, holding a thermos with both hands. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold evening air. "I saw your truck pull in," she said, her voice soft but edged with concern. "Thought you might need something warm. You looked like you wrestled a thunderstorm and lost." Caleb attempted a tired smile. "Not far off." Laura's gaze dipped to the steel lockbox tucked under his arm, her eyes narrowing with intuition. "So, you found something?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the lockbox on the dining table, its dented metal surface catching the golden glow of the overhead lamp. Rocky moved restlessly beside him, tail brushing the wooden floor, still shaken from the collapse. Caleb placed a reassuring hand on the dog's back before turning the lockbox toward him. "You can stay," he told Laura quietly, "if you want." Laura didn't speak, but she pulled out a chair, her expression shifting into that calm, steady patience she carried like a second skin. She sat with her elbows on her knees, ready for whatever came next. Caleb slid into the seat across from her and hesitated before unlatching the lockbox. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the surge of memories the box represented. With a gentle click, the lid opened. Inside lay several thick notebooks tied with frayed twine, stacks of documents folded with meticulous care, and one sealed envelope resting on top. His name was written across it in a handwriting he'd recognize anywhere. Firm strokes, slightly angled, disciplined but human. Caleb. His breath stalled. Laura covered her mouth with her hand. Rocky sniffed the air, then rested his chin on Caleb's knee, sensing the shift in emotion. Caleb reached for the envelope, the paper soft around the edges. He exhaled once, then unfolded the letter. Hayes's words began simply. "If you are reading this, then the tower did not stop you. Good. It means I was right about you." Caleb swallowed hard as he continued. Hayes wrote of his youth, of starting a tiny workshop with two friends, designing early prototypes of protective gear for fire crews before safety standards improved. He described nights working in a rented garage by lamplight, eating cheap sandwiches, living off pennies and persistence. The company, unnamed in the letter but recognizable through details, had grown over decades into a major supplier for several states. Caleb paused, stunned. Hayes had never mentioned any of this. The letter continued. "The day I started that company, I had only $2 left. That's the same bill in your envelope now. Not because it's worth anything, but because it reminds me how little we need to start something that matters. Caleb's pulse quickened as he read on. I kept a portion of the company's value hidden in private accounts. Shares no one knew I retained. They became significant. When I realized I would not outlive my regrets, I rewrote my legacy. Those shares are yours. He blinked slowly, reading the next line twice. Their current value exceeds $34 million. Laura let out a faint gasp, immediately covering her mouth in embarrassment. Caleb hardly noticed. His mind reeled, not at the number, but at the reasoning behind it. Hayes wrote, "You think you failed me the day of the warehouse collapse. You didn't. I gave the order that trapped us. It was my decision that endangered the team, but you carried the guilt because you survived, and I let you. I was a coward in that way." A shiver ran through Caleb's shoulders. He remembered Hayes lying beneath broken beams, smoke choking the air, yelling at him to pull the injured rookie out first. Caleb had always believed he made that choice. Now, he realized Hayes had orchestrated the priorities. "You saved that boy," the letter went on. "You saved Rocky. You saved everyone I failed to." Caleb pressed a hand to his forehead, overwhelmed. Then the next paragraph shifted. "The metal tag was a test, yes, but not a cruel one. I needed to know you were ready to confront the past, not hide from it. Because only someone who has walked into fire and walked out with his integrity intact deserves to decide how safety is shaped for others." Caleb's eyes blurred. Rocky nudged him again, whining softly, sensing the storm inside him. Hayes's final lines trembled on the page. "Use the share value for others. Protect those who have no shield. Build something that outlives both of us. You always knew how to save people, Caleb. Now you can keep doing it, without running into flames." Caleb folded the letter carefully, hands trembling. Silence stretched across the room like a fragile thread. Laura reached across the table, placing her warm hand over his. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He trusted you that much?" For the first time in years, Caleb let a breath escape that felt like a release, not a burden. "I don't know if I can handle this," he admitted. "You've already handled worse," Laura said gently, "and you didn't do it alone." Rocky barked quietly, as if in agreement. Before the moment could settle, Caleb's phone buzzed violently on the table. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. Then another, then another. Notifications flooded in, emails, calls, a voicemail. Laura frowned. "What's happening?" Caleb answered one of the calls hesitantly. Mitchell Hayes's voice exploded through the speaker, sharp and edged with fury. "You think you can steal our inheritance? You think Dad would ever choose you over his own family? This isn't over, Turner. We'll bury that will." Caleb tried to respond, but Mitchell hung up. Another call came. Caroline's number. Then Eleanor's lawyer demanding Caleb return stolen documents immediately. The threats piled, venomous and loud. Laura's expression hardened, a rare sight. "They found out." Caleb sank into the chair, a weight settling onto his shoulders so heavy it ached. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Laura said, "but sometimes the world hands you what someone else wanted for you." Rocky released a low protective growl, pacing in front of the table as if guarding Caleb from the unseen attackers. Caleb rubbed his temples, the swirl of guilt and responsibility colliding in a way that made his chest tight. The past he'd spent years trying to outrun had not only caught up, it had delivered him a crown of fire, and he had no idea how to wear it. Laura leaned closer, voice firm but gentle. "Caleb, what are you going to do?" He stared at the lockbox, at the notebooks that might contain answers, or more burdens. Lightning flickered outside, echoing the storm now inside him. "I don't know," he whispered. But Rocky suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the window, body going still, too still, as if something outside had changed. Laura turned slowly toward the front door, and the knock that followed was so sharp it made Caleb flinch. The knock at the door still echoed faintly in Caleb's ears long after the visitor had left, a junior officer from the sheriff's office, young and earnest, cheeks pink from cold, delivering a simple but unsettling message. A severe winter storm was advancing toward Maple Harbor, projected to be the worst in years. The officer, whose name tag read Deputy Owen Mills, had a boyish look, mid-20s, freckled nose, sandy hair cropped too short for his narrow face. His expression betrayed a nervous eagerness to prove himself, perhaps because he came from a long line of law enforcement officers he feared disappointing. He urged residents to prepare for possible blackouts, flooding along the harbor, and road closures. Then he hurried back into the swirling night, boots splashing as he jogged toward his cruiser. By the time the storm fully arrived, Maple Harbor trembled under its weight. Wind clawed at the windows like a living thing. Snow fell in violent diagonal sheets, whipping across the yard in erratic bursts. The lights flickered twice before surrendering, plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from a battery lantern on the coffee table, its faint yellow glow casting stretching shadows across the walls. Caleb stood in that dim room, the sealed envelope and notebooks still scattered across the table, though now half buried under the fear rising in his rib cage. The distant wail of the town's emergency siren pierced the night again, a sound he once responded to instinctively, but now it seized him by the throat. Rocky paced in tight circles, nails scraping lightly on the wooden floor, before stopping at Caleb's side. The dog rested his heavy head on Caleb's forearm, amber eyes glistening with a wordless plea. Lightning slashed the sky outside, illuminating the dog's scarred leg. Caleb swallowed hard. I'm not that man anymore." Rocky didn't move, his gaze held steady, an anchor in the dark. The radio crackled faintly from the kitchen counter, powered by backup batteries. A frantic voice came through, a city dispatcher, strained and breathless. "The temporary shelter on Mariner Street has lost its roof. Elderly residents exposed, families displaced. Any available volunteers report. Repeat, we need all hands." Caleb's heart thudded like a fist inside him. That shelter, hastily assembled in an old community hall by the waterfront, wasn't built to withstand a storm of this magnitude, and he knew, with a cold clarity, that the nearest structurally safe building capable of housing people tonight was the storage warehouse he was scheduled to sell next month. The warehouse sat on elevated ground, reinforced concrete walls, thick steel beams, and emergency lighting that ran on an isolated generator. He'd inspected it himself. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. Stronger than anything the town had right now. Caleb clenched his jaw. Memories roared up. Heat, smoke, collapsing roofs. His breath caught. He could hear Hayes's voice in the letter. "You always knew how to save people. He squeezed his eyes shut, chest tight. I don't want to go back, he whispered into the dark. At that moment, the back door opened with a gust of freezing wind, and Laura Bennett stepped inside, bundled in a thick rain jacket, hair damp and sticking to her forehead. She carried a large thermos strapped under one arm and a ring of keys in her hand. She shut the door with effort and exhaled sharply. Power's out across most of the east side. The shelter's in chaos. Kids crying. Elderly terrified. Town hall asked for volunteers. I figured you'd... Well, I figured you might need a shove. Her voice quivered. Not from cold, but from urgency. Caleb stared at her, stunned. Laura rarely pushed him. But tonight, there was steel in her eyes beneath the worry. She looked smaller, bundled in her coat, but her presence filled the room with a steadiness the storm couldn't shake. I have the keys to the warehouse office, she said, lifting them slightly. And a working generator there. We tested it last week. It's dry, high ground. If we get people inside, they'll make it through the night. Caleb hesitated, torn between the fear he carried and the instinct that still pulsed in him like an old wound. Caleb, she said more softly, stepping closer. That storm won't wait. You don't have to be a hero. Just be who you've always been. Rocky let out a sharp bark, as if seconding her demand. Something cracked inside him. Not like breaking, but like something long frozen beginning to thaw. Minutes later, they were in his truck. Caleb drove, knuckles pale on the wheel, while Rocky stood braced between the seats, tail stiff, eyes scanning the blizzard outside. Snow battered the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. They reached the warehouse, a squat, concrete structure with boarded windows and a high, arched roof. The lock on the main doors fought Caleb's numb fingers, but with Laura holding a lantern and shielding it from the wind, he managed to get the doors open. Inside, the dark expanse of the warehouse smelled of dust, cold metal, and disuse. Caleb activated the emergency generator. A rumble surged through the building, and a string of industrial lights blinked on overhead, casting long shadows across the wide floor. It wasn't warm, but it was shelter. And in a storm like this, that was everything. Let's go get them, Laura said. They drove street by street, stopping wherever they saw lights or movement. Rocky barked at porches until residents emerged, trembling in blankets, grateful and scared. Elderly couples, exhausted parents carrying toddlers, a single mother clutching a baby to her chest. They climbed into the truck, or followed behind in their cars through the storm. At one point, as they turned down a narrow residential road, Rocky lifted his nose, inhaled sharply, and barked. A different bark, sharp and insistent. He pushed his paws onto the dashboard, staring into the white blur ahead. Caleb slowed. What is it, boy? Rocky whined and pawed at the door. Something's wrong, Laura said quietly. Caleb stopped the truck. Rocky jumped out immediately, nose to the wind, tail down and stiff. He followed the dog, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into wet slush. Rocky pulled him toward a cluster of trees behind a half-flooded playground, where the storm howled like it wanted to bury the world. Then Caleb heard it, barely audible over the wind, a small, terrified sob. Hello? Caleb called out. The sob hiccuped again. Rocky bounded forward, weaving between picnic tables half buried in snow, until he stopped beside the small figure of a boy, curled behind an overturned trash barrel. He couldn't have been older than 7, with dark skin and a shock of black curls plastered to his forehead. His jacket was too thin for the cold, and he shivered violently. Caleb knelt beside him. "Hey there, buddy. You hurt?" The boy shook his head, hugging his knees tighter. "I lost my mom. She told me to run when the roof broke." Caleb felt his heart clench. "You're safe now. We'll get you back to her." Rocky gently nudged the boy's shoulder with his nose. The child's eyes widened, then softened, and he reached shaky fingers toward the dog's fur. Rocky sat, tall and steady, letting the boy cling to him. "You found me," the boy whispered into Rocky's neck. "You're a hero." Caleb swallowed the lump rising in his throat. They brought the boy, whose name was Daniel, back to the truck. He refused to let go of Rocky, so the dog climbed into the back seat with him, curling protectively around the small form. By the time they returned to the warehouse, over 40 people had gathered there. The space buzzed with fear and relief, with gratitude and exhaustion. Volunteers arrived with blankets, canned food, medical kits. Laura moved among them with her thermos, handing out hot drinks, her presence radiating calm. Caleb stepped inside last, breathing hard, snow melting down his neck. The sight before him froze him in place. People huddled together under the lights he had turned on. Children wrapped in borrowed coats, parents thanking him with trembling voices. Daniel asleep against Rocky's warm flank. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Not guilt, not fear, but a quiet, steady certainty. He still knew how to lead people through the dark. And maybe, just maybe, the fire inside him had never gone out. It had only been waiting for the right storm to guide again. But as he stood there, chest rising with a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, the warehouse doors shuddered violently, as if someone outside was pounding against them. Caleb exchanged a look with Laura. Rocky rose instantly, ears raised, body tense. Someone, or something, was out there, and the storm had not yet finished with them. The storm broke at dawn, leaving Maple Harbor washed in silver light and stunned silence. Snow clung to rooftops like fragile armor. Branches lay scattered along sidewalks. Power lines drooped under the weight of ice. And yet, the warehouse, its generator still thrumming like a heart that refused to stop, stood tall on the hill, glowing with faint warmth. Dozens of townspeople slept on makeshift cots beneath its rafters, wrapped in blankets and the soft relief of survival. Caleb Turner barely slept. He sat on a folding chair near the entrance. Rocky curled at his feet, the dog's bandaged hind leg twitching occasionally as he dreamed. A medic from the volunteer team, Harriet Colson, a stout woman in her early 60s with a halo of curly gray hair and eyes sharp as safety pins, had stitched the gash Rocky sustained navigating debris the night before. Harriet had a mother bear personality, the kind who barked orders with warmth hidden underneath. A woman who'd spent 30 years volunteering as an EMT after losing her firefighter husband to a backdraft explosion long ago. She understood heroes too well, human or canine, and she treated Rocky with reverence. "You watch your boy," she had whispered to Caleb as she finished the sutures. "Dogs like him, they run until their heart forgets to stop. Keep him close." Now, as weak sunlight spilled through cracked skylights, Caleb stroked Rocky's neck, feeling the gentle rise and fall of the dog's breath. The bandages smelled faintly of antiseptic, Rocky lifted his head and nudged Caleb's boot with tired affection. "You did more than enough," Caleb murmured. "More than I deserve to ask of you." Rocky blinked slowly, unbothered by praise. By morning, the shelter buzzed with reporters. Local news, then regional, then unexpectedly, a national safety channel that had caught wind of the aging real estate broker and his scarred German shepherd who rescued an entire town block during a historic winter storm. Their cameras flashed as they entered, and though Caleb wanted nothing more than to disappear into the nearest shadow, Laura Bennett stood firmly beside him. Laura looked exhausted but steady, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her rain-spattered jacket now replaced by a thick wool sweater that emphasized her tall, willowy frame. She had an innate calmness that reporters gravitated toward. Her hazel eyes flickered with a tired but resolute glow as she fielded questions, redirecting attention to volunteers, elderly evacuees, and the emergency crews. She held a clipboard, organized, grounded, every inch the quiet leader. Caleb remained behind her, uncomfortable but no longer hiding. Rocky sat upright, despite the limp, tail tapping the floor with slow, deliberate beats. Kids crowded him, whispering, "Good boy," as if he were a legend. Adults stopped Caleb to thank him, gripping his hands with overwhelming gratitude. He tried to deflect, but every gesture pushed him into a truth he could no longer ignore. He had stepped back into the fire, and this time he had walked out with something other than guilt. Before he could process that, a tall man in a fitted navy coat approached through the thinning crowd. His posture was straight, almost military. His salt and pepper hair was clipped neat, and his clean-shaven jaw suggested a meticulous personality. He introduced himself as Richard Lovell, the chief compliance officer from the National Fire Safety Corporation Hayes once helped found. His presence changed the air. "Mr. Turner," Lovell said, extending a firm hand, "I flew in as soon as our legal department finished reviewing your documentation. What you did last night, what your dog did, has been all over the networks. It prompted us to cross-check the shareholder transfer outlined in Captain Hayes's letter." Caleb felt a shadow coil in his stomach. "And?" Lovell smiled, a surprisingly warm expression that softened his stern features. "And it's legitimate, entirely. The board voted this morning. Ownership is yours." A quiet gasp rippled through nearby volunteers. Lovell continued, lowering his voice with respect. "Captain Hayes made it clear you were his chosen successor for the unused shares. Given last night's events, I think it's poetic." Caleb bristled at the word but nodded. Behind him, Rocky leaned against his leg, grounding him. Lovell handed him a slim folder of stamped confirmations. "With this, you'll receive formal control of the holdings. There will be substantial offers coming your way from private investors, developers, safety institutions. But I hope you consider using it in a way that honors what Captain Hayes believed in." He paused, as though measuring Caleb carefully. "You already showed the world last night what you stand for." Then he excused himself, disappearing into the cluster of news crews. Caleb stared down at the folder in his hands, millions contained in several sheets of paper, just ink. And yet, it felt heavier than the steel lockbox. By the afternoon, exhausted residents were relocated to emergency lodgings. The warehouse emptied slowly, leaving echoes of fear and gratitude hanging in the quiet. Caleb stayed behind to sweep debris, though no one asked him to. The simple motion steadied him. Laura returned with city officials, 2 council members, and the mayor. The mayor, Donna Fitzroy, a woman in her late 60s with pale silver hair cropped into a no-nonsense bob, wore a heavy red coat and a stern expression softened by laugh lines. She had the hands of someone who'd grown up working rather than shaking hands, and her voice carried the firmness of a person who had shepherded Maple Harbor through hurricanes, recessions, and scandals. "Caleb," she said once introductions were made, "we need to rebuild a proper emergency shelter, not a temporary patchwork like the one that failed last night. The council wants your advice." Caleb blinked at her. "My advice?" Mayor Fitzroy gestured around the warehouse. "Because you turned this into a safe haven in a matter of hours, and—" her eyes drifted to the folder in his hand. "Because you now have the means to build something permanent, something game-changing." The room fell quiet. Even Rocky sensed the gravity, pressing against Caleb's leg. Caleb swallowed, throat tight. "I'm just trying to keep people safe." "Exactly why you should lead this," the mayor replied gently. Laura stepped closer, placing a warm, steady hand on his arm. "You don't have to decide today," she whispered, but her eyes held encouragement. No pressure, just faith. For a long moment, Caleb stared at the papers again. Memories surged. Smoke, collapse, Hayes's voice, Daniel clutching Rocky, the storm howling outside the warehouse. And beneath them all, the letter's words, "Build something that outlives both of us." His hands trembled, not with fear of losing money, but with the feeling that something in him had shifted. For the first time in a decade, his guilt loosened. Not gone. Those things never truly left, but hollowed out, like a wound finally cleaned. He looked at Laura, then at the mayor, then at Rocky. Rocky gazed back steadily, bandaged legs stiff but unwavering, as if offering his own vote. Wordless, loyal, unbreakable. Caleb finally nodded. "Draw up the plan," he said hoarsely. "I'm in." The mayor smiled, soft, grateful, relieved. But just as the tension in the room relaxed, Rocky stiffened abruptly, ears lifting, gaze locking toward the warehouse's open door. A low growl rolled from his chest. Snow swirled outside in restless spirals. Something, someone, was approaching. Laura turned, brow creasing. "Who is that?" Footsteps crunched on the snow, slow and deliberate. A shadow moved across the doorway, and Caleb's breath caught, because even from a distance, he recognized the outline. Even though he had hoped he would never see one of the Hayes family again tonight. Snow drifted lazily across Maple Harbor that morning, not in the violent sheets that once tore roofs away, but in soft spirals that danced gently above the newly paved courtyard of the Hayes Safe Harbor Center. The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to warm the brick walls, but the building seemed to glow anyway, its wide windows reflecting fire orange hues from heaters inside, its wind-resistant roof angled like a protective wing over the town. Once a simple warehouse on a forlorn hill, it now stood as the beating heart of the community. Caleb Turner pushed open the side doors, holding them long enough for Rocky to limp through. The German shepherd's gait, slower than in the early years, but still dignified. His once dark coat had softened to a mottled pattern of black, tan, and silver, especially around the muzzle where time had dusted him with white. His amber eyes remained alert, still the eyes of a working dog, still seeking cues, still reading the room before a human could. Rocky paused, sniffing the air as if verifying that everything inside remained safe and undisturbed. Caleb chuckled, tugging his gloves tighter. I know, buddy. One last sweep before the day starts. Inside, the center hummed with the gentle, everyday chaos it had earned. Volunteers set up chairs for the trauma support circle. Teenagers stacked crates of donated blankets. A trio of retired firefighters sorted through smoke mask kits for the next community drill. A cheerful mix of voices echoed beneath the high ceiling. Near the far wall stood Miriam Clark, a new counselor in her early 50s, with warm brown skin, soft curls bouncing around her ears, and a smile that suggested she had spent decades coaxing frightened people into breathing again. She waved her clipboard when she spotted Caleb. Good morning. I'm adding 2 more families to tonight's storm prep workshop, she called out. Word spread that Rocky's demonstrating how to detect gas leaks again. Rocky puffed his chest ever so slightly, like a dog who knew he had a following. Caleb laughed. He gets more requests than I do. That's because he takes better notes, Miriam teased, winking before heading toward the classrooms. As they walked deeper into the center, children ran past, bundled in winter mittens. One little girl, 5 or 6 years old, stopped dead in her tracks when she spotted Rocky. She had short blonde hair tucked behind small ears and wore a puffy purple jacket almost too big for her. She approached with cautious reverence. Mr. Turner, she whispered shyly, can I give him a hug good morning? Her name was Maddie Owens, a spirited child whose mother worked 2 jobs and relied on the center for early drop-off. She had a gentle nature and an almost eerie intuition for when adults needed comforting. Caleb knelt beside her. Of course. Just be gentle. His leg's still a little sore. Maddie wrapped her small arms around Rocky's neck. Rocky leaned into her, eyes closing for a heartbeat as if borrowing her warmth. Caleb's throat tightened. He always found himself moved by moments like this. Small gestures that reminded him the center wasn't just brick and beams. It was a container for softened hearts. He stood, exhaling slowly. These last years had changed him. The guilt once welded to his ribs had loosened. He still carried it. After all, trauma doesn't vanish. It simply shifts weight. But he no longer let it define his worth. He had learned to build from it, not around it. When he reached the main office, Laura Bennett was already inside, her figure framed by a wide window. She wore a thick navy sweater over dark slate jeans, her auburn hair tied loosely, as always. Time had left faint creases at the corners of her eyes, but they only deepened her warmth. She looked up from the stack of paperwork. Caleb, she said, smiling with that quiet familiarity they'd grown into. We just got an email from Harrison Ridge. His eyebrows rose. The mountain town? The one dealing with mudslide fallout? Laura nodded. They're requesting a full consultation. They want to build a shelter patterned after ours, and they asked specifically if you'd come speak at their opening. Caleb let out a slow breath. Opportunities like that had become more common in the last few years, more than he ever expected. Some towns asked for architectural guidance. Others wanted help training volunteers. A few simply wanted Caleb and Rocky to stand on stage as symbols of what a community could become when fear didn't get the final word. He rubbed the back of his neck. Another one, huh? You don't have to say yes, she replied gently. But I think Hayes would have liked knowing his seed grew this far. Caleb looked around the office. The framed photo of the original warehouse on opening day, the plaque honoring Franklin Hayes's legacy, the glass display containing the faded $2 bill and the weathered metal tag. They hung not as trophies, but as compass points. He nodded slowly. Let's help them. Before Laura could respond, Rocky barked sharply, just once, but with purpose. Caleb and Laura turned. At the entrance stood Theo Ramirez, a lanky young man in his early 20s with dark, wavy hair, olive skin, and earnest brown eyes. He wore a reflective vest and carried a bundle of fresh blueprints under one arm. Theo was one of their brightest trainees, a former foster kid whose life had been stitched together by social workers and firefighters until he found stability within the center's programs. He was studying emergency management at the local community college. Mr. Turner, Theo called breathlessly, you've got to see this. The contractors finished the foundation for the canine therapy wing. Rocky's ears perked. Caleb blinked. Already? Theo grinned. Way ahead of schedule. And, sir? He lifted a sheet of paper with a bold stamp across the top. We also got final approval for the federal matching grant. Caleb exhaled a long, shaky breath. The therapy wing, their most ambitious addition, would offer service dog training, grief counseling, and in-crisis kenneling for families who had no place to keep pets during emergencies. It had grown from Laura's idea, fed by Rocky's story, and nurtured by townspeople who believed animals also carried emotional burdens. He felt Laura's hand slip into his. You did it, she whispered. Caleb shook his head. We did it. Theo stepped aside as several children burst into the lobby, calling Rocky's name. A teacher from the after-school program, a tall, soft-spoken man named Ernest Whitby, with sandy hair and glasses too large for his narrow face, chased gently after them. Sorry, Mr. Turner, Ernest said, almost tripping over a mat. They heard Rocky's in the building. Rocky tolerated the sudden audience with regal patience, wagging his tail once in acknowledgement of each child. Caleb scratched the dog's head softly. You're still the star, he murmured. Standing amid all that movement, children laughing, volunteers preparing, town officials stopping by with signatures to collect, Caleb felt something settle inside him. A sense of belonging he hadn't felt since before the warehouse fire all those years ago. A sense that what he'd built was no longer patched together out of guilt, but rooted in purpose. Yet underneath all the joy, a faint melancholy shimmered. Rocky was aging, his limp more pronounced, his breaths heavier after long days. Caleb knew the inevitable truth, but didn't dare name it. Not yet. Instead, he kneeled and pressed his forehead to Rocky's. One more good year, he whispered. Let's make it count. Rocky licked his chin gently. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, drills, and unexpected visitors dropping off casseroles as thanks. Near sunset, Caleb stepped outside. Maple Harbor's sky turned a brilliant ribbon of peach and violet. The center lights flicked on, glowing like a lighthouse on the hill. Laura wrapped her arm around his. Looks beautiful, doesn't it? Caleb nodded. Feels like home. The laughter of children drifted out. Rocky from inside barked once. A warm, familiar sound. Caleb looked at the horizon, at the land that once held nothing but regret, and felt a swell of peace. What began as a crumpled $2 bill and a metal tag meant to test him had grown into a haven for generations. A place where safety wasn't just a promise, it was a practice. He whispered, almost to the wind, "You were right, Hayes. Wealth is responsibility." He closed his eyes, letting the cold breeze brush his face. Inside, Rocky barked again. 2 short, excited barks. Caleb and Laura exchanged a glance and hurried in. Children were gathered at the new foundation site, pointing upward. Daylight was fading, but there, suspended above the future therapy wing, hung a temporary banner. It fluttered, caught on a scaffold hook, as if placed there by fate itself. Printed across the fabric in big, bold letters. Safe harbor, a home for every soul. 2-legged or 4. Caleb felt his breath stop for a moment. Laura squeezed his hand, and Rocky, tail wagging, limped to Caleb's side and sat tall as if claiming his place beneath the words. The future shimmered ahead, wide, warm, and ready. Some miracles from God don't arrive wrapped in thunder or glory. Sometimes they come quietly, in a crumpled old bill, a worn metal tag, a loyal dog who refuses to leave your side, or a weary man who finally finds the courage to stand where he once fell. Caleb and Rocky's journey reminds us of something timeless. God never abandons the ones He's shaping. He places small seeds in each of us. The seed of compassion, the seed of responsibility, the seed of healing. And when we choose to serve, to love, to rise above fear, that seed becomes a blessing not only for ourselves, but for everyone around us. In your own life, you may be carrying a crumpled note too, a past wound, a heavy memory, a test you didn't ask for. But often, these are the very things God uses to guide you toward who you were meant to be. If you're still breathing, then God is still working in your story. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, or what part of the story meant the most to you. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the weekly stories of healing, courage, and God's quiet miracles moving through everyday lives. May God bless you, protect your home, comfort your soul, and surround your family with His peace. May He walk with you in the storms, lift you in your weariness, and show you the small miracles hidden in every step. Amen.